Welcome to this seminar brought to you by the Danish Institute for International Studies, which aspires to a leading role connecting rigorous academic research to high-level policy debates on key challenges facing our world. I'm Pier Schouten, and I'll be hosting today's discussion together with Signe Marie Kolt-Raunenkilde. Exactly 1 week ago, leading scientists published yet another alarming review confirming how human consumption and population growth are pushing global biodiversity and climate patterns over tipping points. On that same day, 3 UN peacekeepers lost their lives in the latest rebel attack in the Timbuktu region of Mali. Increasingly, it is becoming recognized that these two may hang together. This event explores how climate change and armed violence interact by focusing on 2 geographical hotspots where both dynamics seem to converge. As violence reaches unprecedented levels in the Sahel and Central Africa, these regions are hotspots of a toxic nexus of violent conflict, climate stress, and dwindling resources. This seminar explores this nexus, zooming in on how armed groups govern access to coveted resources. Are these conflicts a taster of the impending climate wars? Does climate change present an opportunity for rebels, or are other causes more important to understand the drivers of conflict in this part of the world? Encompassing both the Sahel and Central Africa, and I will start my slides here. There we go. The Sudano-Sahel is a distinct ecological zone in between the Sahara and the equatorial rainforest, made up of arid grasslands. It is one of the largest still intact wilderness areas in the world, but also home to an important population of farmers and herders, which have developed expert strategies to profit from spatially and seasonally variable resources, rearing cattle and farming crops. These complementary strategies are premised on mobility and flexible access to shared landscapes. The Sudano-Sahel is, for instance, home to the largest seasonal livestock migrations, or transhumance, in the world, fertilizing soils and delivering proteins to farming populations in exchange for fodder and other plant-based products. One increasingly hears about how climate change in this region undermines these livelihood strategies to the point of menacing their sustainability. The intuitive argument goes, increasing drought reduces available resources, leading to competition that can ultimately unleash violent conflict. Lake Chad has come to epitomize this narrative. Pictures show how rapidly Lake Chad has dried up over time, and the soggy area it left behind has become a refuge for Boko Haram. And this notorious extremist group is only one of a whole ecosystem of armed groups that seem to operate exactly where natural resources seem dwindling. But this simplistic narrative overshadows more complex realities. Recent measurements challenge the idea that Lake Chad is drying up. Parts of the Sahara are becoming greener, and many places are experiencing more intense but shorter rainy seasons, with unpredictable effects for plant life, farming, and herding. Climate research shows so many contradictory and locally specific dynamics that it has moved away from talking linear climate change to speak of climate variability instead. And while resource degradation may coincide with conflict, are these two causally related? These seemingly philosophical questions become a matter of life and death, where the answers inform high-impact interventions. While many in the audience are working hard to put climate factors on high-level security agendas, others are wary of weaponizing climate adaptation in counterinsurgency efforts. But I think we are here today all joined together around a shared bottom line concern, with understanding the nexus between climate change, conflict, and natural resources in the Sahel and Central Africa, because we're all interested in supporting the inhabitants of the Sudano-Sahel to reconsolidate their responsibility over their territory and the management of their natural resources. And here I borrow a formulation from Saverio Catti. The fact that so many of you are here with us today, over 300 people from very diverse backgrounds, attests to how little we know about this question, despite the groundbreaking work that is being done. In the coming hour and a half, we'll try and dig a little deeper. And we have an exciting lineup of speakers whose interventions surely will provoke many questions during the Q&A. First, we'll have two presentations to set the broad scene, starting with Luca Raineri from the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa. Luca is a researcher in security studies with over a decade of experience looking at conflicts and interventions in the Sahara and particularly Mali. He'll start off by a presentation entitled Sahel Climate Conflicts When Fighting Climate Change Fuels Terrorism, and here the fighting is between brackets. Then it's an honor to have Thierry Vircolon with us, formerly with the International Crisis Group and now coordinator of the Central and Southern Africa Observatory of the French Institute for Foreign Affairs. Thierry is an expert on Central Africa, and he'll talk about what happens when the Sahel meets Central Africa, understanding a new geopolitical reality. After these scene-setting presentations, we'll move on to hear the latest from the region itself. Anyone who's following Mali has probably heard of Boubacar Ba, who's been working on many of the defining studies on what's going on in this native Mali, where he's the director of the Center for Analysis on Governance and Security in the Sahel, based in Bamako. Today, he'll present some of the stuff he's finding out about during ongoing collaborative research with SIGNE about how armed groups are governing natural resources and turning them into a weapon of war in central Mali. From Mali, we'll move to the borderlands of the Central African Republic, where researchers from Cameroon, Chad, and the Central African Republic are involved in an ongoing collaborative research effort around how armed groups are positioning themselves as brokers of access to pastures for transboundary herders. After I lay out the contours of the situation, Soleil Parfait Kalesopo, an independent consultant from the Central African Republic with years of experience researching the political economy of conflict, will tell us exactly how rebel groups govern cattle mobility. Then from Chad, we have Pababe Souknabe, an expert on Sahelian pastoral systems working for the Chadian pastoralist platform, and Amadou Amadou, a magistrate from Cameroon and PhD student at Leiden University, excuse me, as well as the national president of the Mbororo Social and Cultural Development Association. Both of them will explore why herders from their countries choose to take their cattle to the conflict-ridden Central African Republic and how they navigate the landscape of armed groups there. Before we move to the presentations, just a few practical points. First of all, this event is being recorded and will subsequently appear on YouTube, so no need to take notes, and you can share it with your colleagues after. Second of all, the speakers from Central Africa will present in French and will have simultaneously translation available for you. There will be a button in your screen allowing you to switch on English translation. Thirdly, you can post a question to any of the speakers at any time during the event, and we'll try to make sure it'll get addressed during the Q&A. Feel free to do so in French if that's what you feel most comfortable with. If you do, post a comment, please mention your name and affiliation. Finally, we hope to see this as part of a collective conversation. So don't hesitate to contact any of us afterwards with any query you might have. Without further ado, Luca, the floor is yours. You're muted, Luca.
Sorry, I was muted, but I was thanking the Danish Institute for International Studies for having me here and organizing this very interesting conversation. I'll try to share the slides that I prepared for this event. I hope that you're now able to see them. My presentation is based on a brief that I have recently published with the European Institute for Security Studies based in Paris. And it is about Sahel climate conflicts with a question mark. The aim is perhaps a bit provocative, that is to say, to question the narrative that assumes or is built on the idea that there is a nexus between conflicts and climatic events in the Sahel. So hoping that you're now being able to see my second slide. The climate conflict nexus argument is one of the many attempts to provide an explanation to the soaring levels of armed violence experienced in the Sahel. We all know about the tragic trajectory of the Sahel, and especially the three border regions between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, with increasing level of violence experienced and suffered by local populations, in many cases at the hands of jihadist armed groups that are present in the region. The standard argument goes in the following manner. It is a context characterized by environmental degradation, which, coupled with a significant population growth, leads to increasing competition to access over dwindling natural resources. And this somehow fuels conflict and radicalization. So there is this idea that armed conflicts and terrorist violence are linked to, if not even driven by, climatic and environmental factors. Now, what I would like to argue today is that this is indeed a seductive argument. The problem is that this argument is not always backed up by conclusive or even convincing evidence. Environmental factors, climate variables, and conflict dynamics do interact, but in complex ways that fail to exhibit demonstrable causal links. So this is the state of the evidence as far as we know. For sure, climate variability does exist in the Sahel, but what type of variability are we talking about? There are indeed rising temperatures that are recorded, but not everywhere. Some parts of Mali are indeed experiencing unprecedented rising temperatures, while in other parts, for instance, of Niger, temperatures are indeed rising, but below the global warming worldwide mean. There is indeed extreme rainfall variability, but it's important to highlight that in the Sahel, exception can be considered the norm. Climatologists tend to agree that the Sahel climate is one of extreme, and that implies that exceptional weather and climatic events are paradoxically the norm, especially if longer time spans are examined. So historical records and geological data both confirm that multi-decadal droughts have occurred quite regularly throughout the Sahel's history, leading climatology to conclude that there is no such thing as normal rainfall in the Sahel. And the lack of a baseline undermines comparisons, making the detection of variations highly dependent on the arbitrary choice of the time period selected. And the same is true when desertification is considered. Desertification was very prominent and possibly observable 30 to 40 to 50 years ago. However, more accurate evidence that has been made available by satellite sensing is suggesting that the process is now reverting. The Sahelian strip south of the Sahara is reportedly much greener than it used to be 30 to 40 years ago, and possibly than at any point in history for which data is available, with denser cover tree and increase in water bodies. So not only the basic question whether what climate variability is being experienced in the Sahel, there is also, and perhaps most importantly, a question that is linked to the nexus between climate variability and conflicts. There's no doubt that conflicts over natural resources do exist in the Sahel, but there are persisting disagreements over whether and how such conflicts are or can be connected to climatic and environmental changes. There has been a lot of research that is carried out trying to answer these questions, and unsurprisingly in the research environment, answers do not converge. We see, for instance, different answers to the question of whether the correlation, there is a correlation between rainfall variability and conflict in the Sahel, with a study claiming that there is no connection between droughts and conflicts in the Sahel, but then another study claiming that yes, there is a connection between droughts and conflicts in the Sahel, although the results of this second study by the World Bank are not robust to further testing. And then there are other studies suggesting that it's not so much a matter of rainfall variability, a matter of droughts, it is a matter of rainfall variability, including both lack and excess, which, if taken as a proxy of climate change, can somehow have an impact on conflicts. However, a study from OECD has found only a very weak correlation, which incidentally relies on a very broad definition of what counts as conflict. And similarly, scholars disagree as to whether the decreasing water level of Lake Chad has led to conflict escalation because of greater competition for resources, including water, or rather it has led to an appeasement because of the greater accessibility of fertile lands made available by the shrinking of the lake. So, departing from the Malthusian assumptions of early studies, recent research approaches conceptualize climate variability and change less as direct drivers of conflict than as a threat multipliers that interact in complex ways with pre-existing vulnerability. And this has led to a greater focus on governance issues that mediate between environmental stressors and societal outcomes. So what I would like to argue today is a sort of a counterintuitive nexus between conflicts and environmental and climatic factors by presenting some instances in which attempts to fight climate change has yielded unexpected and collateral damage, fueling terrorism rather than appeasing it. And this is, in my opinion, very problematic because this climate conflict nexus narrative indeed permeates both UN and regional strategies, including by the EU, to tackle the root causes of insecurity and conflict in the Sahel. The problem is that false assumptions have led, in some cases, to wrong approaches. Now, in the policy brief that I mentioned, I tackled 3 of these instances. For the sake of time today, I think I will only present 2 of them, that is to say, those that have to do with reforesting program and the role of the Forest Service in the Sahel, and those that have to do with attempts to tackle food insecurity and food shortages in the region. So talking about the rising and fall of Forest Service, or as they are called, les agents des eaux et des forêts in the Sahelian area. In my own research, I was particularly struck by the fact that les agents des eaux et des forêts, Forest Service guys, have become the primary target of acts of violence, of targeted killings carried out by jihadist groups. And this obviously prompts the question of what's wrong with this particular law enforcement body, law enforcement organization. I think that this has to do with the misunderstanding of the drivers of climate change, and in particular with wrong approaches to tackle this. There is indeed the idea that population growth in the Sahel has led to rising cooking, housing, and farming needs that local population try to meet by engaging in logging, by exploiting local woods. But this has led to unsustainable patterns of logging, leading to deforestation and therefore to desertification. So there is this aggregate misbehaviors by local population that are presumed to be part of the causes that explain rising temperatures and desertification in the area. Now, irrespective of whether this analysis is true or not, the point is that the response has relied extensively on law enforcement measures, including harshly implemented law enforcement, essentially with the empowerment of the Forest Service and Ranger Corps and the adoption of harsher penalties for informal logging activities. But I think that it's important to highlight that forest services in the region are paramilitary agencies that are inherited from colonial rule and tasked with enforcing the conservation of natural resources, in which the transition from colonial domination to post-colonial authoritarian regimes back in the 70s and 80s has smoothed a sort of continuity of coercive practices mandated by political elites in the capitals against unruly rural subjects. In Mali, for instance, in 1986, the military leadership amended the colonial law establishing the forest services by increasing the severity of the penalties, inflating the fines, and authorizing heavy-handed approaches to inhibit informal logging. And all this with the financial and political support of international donors seeking to avert further environmental crises and uphold the sustainable development agenda. Forest services of the Sahel countries, however, are seen by local population to be operating in tacit partnership with national political elites and local customary leaders. So the result has been that these law enforcement have been implemented with no strings attached, leading to a rise in cases of extortion, corruption, abuses, targeting in particular those ethnic and social groups whose livelihoods depend on customary access to natural resources. And I would like to emphasize the social aspect here, not only the ethnic one, but those of you who are familiar with the Sahel know that groups are organized hierarchically, and therefore that law enforcement may be easily seen as flanking local elites to the detriment of local marginalized groups, even if these groups belong to the same ethnicity. And it's important to highlight that violent entrepreneurs have proved very skilled at tapping into this deep-seated sense of frustration. Jihadist leaders in the region have built their reputation and gained some degree of local acceptance by leveraging Sahelian countries' bad governance and the everyday experiences of abuses allegedly suffered by marginalized groups in the region. So it is therefore hardly surprising that the Forest Service officers have often been the primary targets of terrorist attacks in both central Mali and northern Burkina Faso. Another case that I would like to bring before your attention is the problem of food shortages. It is well known that the whole Sahelian area is characterized by frequent food shortages. And this has led both local governments and their international partners to adopt policies meant to increase the food output. Now, it's important to stress that these policies have been indeed remarkably successful, with levels of malnutrition and denutrition in the region declining considerably, albeit unevenly across the region, but there's no doubt that people are better fed in the Sahel now than they used to be 10, 20, 50 years ago. Also, the food output in the region has considerably increased, keeping pace with and sometimes even exceeding the significant population growth of the region. Now, these observations contribute to questioning the idea that environmental degradation interacts with population growth to fuel conflicts over access to dwindling resources. Resources are not necessarily dwindling. And the Mopti region in central Mali could theoretically provide a most likely case for this theory of conflict environment nexus to hold. In fact, in the Mopti region, fragile agro-pastoral food production systems coexist, and the region has indeed become the hotspot of communal clashes and terrorist attacks in the last few years. Yet, if one disaggregates the data at subnational levels, the conclusion in the Mopti region is that cereal production has tripled over the last 15 years. It has not gone down at a much faster pace than the population growth. So the problem here does not appear to lie in the scarcity of food per se, which has markedly declined, but in the fact that throughout the years, Sahelian food policies have devoted a much greater share of attention and resources to agriculture rather than to animal farming. That is, the expansion of arable land and cereal production across the region has largely been achieved to the detriment of pastoralism. And this not only for the perceived greater food output of agriculture, but also, and most importantly, because agriculture is better aligned with the ideological and economic interests of the ruling elite in the Sahelian capitals. The rise in conflicts related to land allocation and use, combined with the decreasing confidence in the judicial and traditional dispute settlement mechanisms, has fueled a strong demand for protection by animal farmers. And jihadist groups have been particularly skilled at exploiting the inter- and intra-communal clashes that ensued. So the argument connecting conflict and terrorism to resource competition can retain some value only if it is reserved not so much to food availability per se, but to the factors of food production and their governance. First and foremost, the land, So development policies or security development policies that overlook this aspect and only aim to increase the agricultural output run the risk of aggravating the problem that they are meant to address. And this is my last slide. I hope I've not been too long, but I think it's important to draw some lessons from these cases, from past failures. The problematic cases analyzed in this presentation, I hope provide some valuable lessons to be learned and incorporated in future programs or environmental protection and sustainable development sponsored by Sahel's international partners. In first place, the idea that terrorism and climate change are somehow connected is a seductive one. And it is so because it offers international donors the opportunity to kill two birds with one stone by addressing jointly what are arguably the most pressing issues facing the international community, that is to say, terrorism and climate change. And that is very helpful if you want to overcome political divides, for instance, in the EU Parliament or in the EU Council. And it also provides local governments with the narrative that depoliticizes conflicts and downplays their own responsibilities. The problem with this narrative is that it is not backed up by convincing evidence. In second place, the narrow focus on abstract variables that is privileged by large-scale big data studies is often inappropriate. And I think it's important to stress the relevance of more qualitative, fine-grained accounts that allow for contextualization and socio-political nuance. These are better suited to grasping the complex interactions between climate variability and conflict escalation. That such an approach, more qualitative, inhibits generalizations may be, in my opinion, after all, good news for policymaking, because lacking context sensitivity, one-size-fits-all responses to security challenges have proved recipes for failure. In third place, the governance frameworks regulating access to natural resources are key to processing environmental and societal stressors, making them veer towards either conflict escalation or conflict mitigation. Violent entrepreneurs, including violent extremist entrepreneurs, leverage the grievances of rural people who feel marginalized, dispossessed, and deprived of decision-making about the allocation and use of natural resources. In short, vulnerability increases when environmental protection is administered in a top-down manner by authoritarian rulers or technocratic elites without local communities' participation. And I think that the counterfactual argument is also true. There is no shortage of examples of positive interactions between Sahelian administrations, international donors, and rural communities whose buy-in in environmental protection projects has ensured sustainability and resilience to violent extremism. In conclusion, I think it would be wrong, as well as clearly paternalistic, to assume that Sahel rural communities are somehow stubbornly uninterested in environmental protection and climate change mitigation. Throughout the centuries, traditional African practices have devised ingenious and sophisticated techniques to ensure the production and reproduction of natural resources, achieving a careful environmental balance between natural and anthropogenic systems. Jihadist leaders have proved particularly skilled at monopolizing the revival of traditional Sahelian modes of natural resource governance, with their message being favorably received by rural communities who are disillusioned by the mirage of modernity. Aligning this revival with the international concern for environmental protection, I think could contribute to undermining jihadist propaganda. And I will stop there. I thank you for your attention and remain available for questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Luca. Without much further ado, I will ask Thierry to continue. And please do write your questions in the Q&A, and to the extent possible, we will try to pick up on them from there.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the organizers for the opportunity to talk to you about the Central African Republic in its regional environment. My name is Thierry Vircoulon. I work for the French Institute for International Affairs, and I'm running their observatory for Central and Southern Africa. What I'm going to tell you today is based on several trips that I've done before the COVID pandemics in northern CAR and southern Chad. And it also comes from an article that I've published at the beginning of this year in an academic journal called Hérodote in France. You can find it basically there. What is, I mean, the conflict in the Central African Republic has started in 2012, so that is now 8 years old. So it's quite a long time now. And what is obvious is that this conflict is showing the regional geopolitical transformation of this part of Africa. I will be short and make my argument and divide my argument into three points. Basically, what we can call Central Sahel is moving south to Central Africa, to what we are calling the Central African region. And the conflict in Central Africa is revealing this trend. Now, the first way, firstly, the way it demonstrates that phenomenon or that new geopolitical transformation is the fact that a lot of armed groups and militiamen from Chad and Sudan have been involved in Central African Republic. At the beginning of this century, there were already lots of groups of bandits called the Zaraginas, who were located in northern Central African Republic at the border between Cameroon and Chad. And they were practicing banditry there, harassing the local communities and attacking trans-border traders. So those groups were made of people from Central African Republic, from Cameroon, from Chad, and even some from Sudan. And there were already some transnational bandits. We can call them transnational bandits. With the CAR conflict that broke out in 2012, we saw a flow of militiamen from Sudan, especially Darfur, and Chad. They were part of the Seleka. And there was, when you look at the Sudanese, for instance, there was a contingent of Sudanese militiamen led by a famous Darfuri warlord called Musa Assime, who was integrated into the Seleka and who was in Bangui in 2013, doing looting and all this sort of things. The fact that a lot of, and Musa Assime, I mentioned him because he was there at the beginning of the Seleka, and then he came back in Central African Republic in 2018, and he was identified by the UN in CAR again. So he's used to move to cross the border quite often, and it's typical of the situation of those armed groups that are moving between Sudan and Darfur, Chad, and CAR very freely. So you have that move, that free move of bandits between the three countries. And of course, this move is made possible by the lack of border control capacity from the CAR authorities for a very long time now. It's also made possible by the fact that the Sudanese and Chadian regime have also lost control of their rebellious peripheries for a long time now, and especially Darfur. And there's been, those areas are more or less lawless. and their governance is characterized by some sort of co-management, you can say that, between warlords and government authorities. And from time to time, the authorities in Khartoum and in N'Djamena have encouraged militiamen of those regions to go to CAR as an easy money-making scheme, basically. So to go there and to plunder the place and make money there. So CAR has become, over time, some sort of an area, a traditional area for regional bandits. And what we've seen with that conflict is that now those regional bandits are even coming from further away than Chad and Sudan, but also from Niger. If you consider, for instance, that one of the main armed groups in CAR, the UPC, is led by a warlord that originates from Niger and from a specific Mbororo clan coming from Niger. So the first point I want to stress is this integration of CAR into a system of regional banditry coming from the north, from the Sahel. The second point is that if you look below or behind the infiltration of regional bandits, you see pastoralists and you see communities. Over the past 20 years, basically, the cattle migration in CAR have been going deeper and deeper into the CAR territories. I'm not going to go into the history of cattle migration in CAR because it dates back from the beginning of the 20th century, but just to summarize it very quickly, there was a time, let's say end of the last century, where basically cattle migration was limited to the northern part of CAR and to the western part of CAR. And now cattle migration is everywhere. Actually, the whole territory is accessible to cattle coming from the north. And we have now, at the beginning of this century, herders have even crossed the border between CAR and the DRC. And they have now, there are several groups of herders, of Fulani herders, who have now settled in the northeast of the DRC in two provinces called Owele and Bawele. So they have crossed the whole territory of CAR and have now moved even to the territory of the Congo. And so behind that cattle migration that was seasonal and that has now become kind of permanent, with most of the territory of CAR being concerned by this phenomenon, what is obvious is the move of communities coming from the north, from Chad and Darfur. And we are settling down in the CAR. I was in Sar, which is a town south of Chad, in 2019. And there I was very surprised by the fact that in local restaurants, they were selling camel meat. And I asked why they were selling camel meat. And they told me, well, now the camel, when it's the season of the migration, when it's a dry season, the camel reach Sar. So that's how we can get camel meat. And of course, it is a sign that progressively, due to the factors that Luca mentioned previously about climate change and degradation of natural resources, etc., those communities are moving south, and also with their cattle. Obviously, the pastoralist communities are moving south with their cattle. Before, I mean, some time ago, the camels were not going to the south of N'Djamena, but now they reaching south during the dry season, which is really close to the border of Car. So you have that move of the cattle, which goes deeper and deeper in the south, and at the same time you have a settlement of the pastoralist communities that are also moving south and south. Of course, if now you find a lot of Salamat people living and having settling down now for several years in the northern part of Car, it's because they also moved in Chad. And it's obvious that you have had a lot of communities moving south in Chad and in Sudan. And now they're reaching the Central African Republic. And that's the reason why now you have a much more diverse composition of the pastoralist communities in the Car than you had before. Before, most of the pastoralists in Car were Fulani people. Now you have more and more Arab, pastoralist Arab coming to the Central African Republic. And so that move is it's a regional move. It's happening in Chad, it's happening in Sudan, and one of the consequences is that it's also happening in the Car. The third trend that we see concerning that geopolitical transformation in the region is that the economic networks between Car, Chad, and Sudan are being strengthened. Those trade networks pre-existed the conflict, of course. As everybody knows, in all the cities in the Car, you always find Sudanese and Chadian traders who have been there for a very long time. And so they had already those trade networks with their country of origin. But what we've seen with the conflict is that those networks, those economic networks, trade networks, have been reinforced due to the disruption of the trade routes between Bangui and the rest of the countries, basically, the other cities in the country. And of course, that disruption is due to the fact that there are a lot of insecurity on the road. So what we see from an economic perspective now, it has all the goods that were coming from Bangui to those cities, or the markets of those cities, are now imported from Chad and Sudan, and that the products, agricultural products, gold and wood, that were sold to Bangui are now reoriented to Sudan and to Chad. And so you have clearly with that conflict a reorientation of trade routes between the cities, some cities and some region in the Car to Sudan and Chad. Yes. So just to finish and conclude, and in the interest of time, what that conflict has shown is that you had it firstly showed for the observers an integration of Car into the regional conflict system created by Sudan and Chad. It showed also the integration of Car into the pastoralist regional system of Chad and Car. And now, as I said, even northern part of the DRC is concerned. And it shows the integration of Car into the economic system also of Sudan and Chad. There are three consequences, and I'll finish with that, about this situation. The first one, as I said, is that we see a diversification of the pastoralist communities living in the CAR now. It's not only the Fulanis, but it's also the Arab pastoralists that are settling down in the CAR. Secondly, there is a disconnect between the institutional affiliation of CAR. You know that CAR is part of the Central African Regional Economic Development Community. So there is a disconnect between this affiliation and the economic realities, or the trade realities. And thirdly, of course, in the CAR local community, there is a strong feeling of Muslim invasion, depending, of course, from the region, who are more or less impacted by the movement of those communities coming from Sudan and Chad. But there is a feeling of Muslim invasion that reactivate, in a way, the memory of the expansion of the slave trade in the second part of the 19th century. And so, of course, this perception is also contributing to the conflict situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thierry. And thank you also very much, Luca, for some very excellent presentations opening up this debate about the climate conflict nexus, and also not least pointing to both some of the unintended consequences of climate change interventions in the Sahel, but also looking at what are some of the regional spillovers of this conflict, and both of you also pointing to colonial and post-colonial historical legacies. With that, I'm very pleased to present Boubacar Ba, who's going to present, of course, his own research, and also based on a policy brief that I've been honored to do with him lately. Please, Boubacar Ba, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marie. I would like, first of all, to thank DIIS and all the colleagues who are on this panel. I would like to present the theme concerning our policy brief linked the problem of the conflict in the Mopti region. I would like to focus my presentation in 3 points. The first point is our study we conduct with Marie concerning the commitment of the armed groups, the community clashes, and the extremism violence in the Mopti region. This is the point I would like to explain and to try to present you the case of the Mopti region. In this second point, I will present the case of the Delta region, the flooded place in the Delta region and the Darland place. And after, in third point, I will give you some recommendations. In the first point, I would like to inform you when we conducted the study with Marie in Mopti region in the last quarter of 2012, we analyzed the case with parajurists and local interviewers. We discussed and interviewed some 100 people. We have the local leaders, what we call legitimacy leaders, traditional, customary, and religious leader. We discuss with the agriculture, pastoralists, young, women, parajurists, administration, mayor, and elected people. And we got a critical mass of people. When we conduct the study, we prepare the policy brief. And then we explain why the crisis moved from the north in the center. And we analyze the case of the Mopti region concerning the Darland place. And then we notice some problems in Koro and Bankas and Douanza districts. The first problem is the intervention of 3 actors. First is the groups called armed groups. We have militias group and jihadist group. The jihadist group are composed in two components. We have Vejnim, that means the group of the support of Islam and Muslim, and the group of Al-Qaeda groups. And Al-Qaeda is composed of the Katiba of Masina, and the other groups is Dawlatul Islamiyah. Dawlatul Islamiyah is important group who born just 2 years ago, and this group is very important in the place of the Gourma and the central of Mali. And we notice after 5 and 3 years of conflict, with very important clashes, like Ogosagu in 1999, Sobanda, and after other clashes, very big clashes, we notice that the population accept to have an agreement. The agreement is between the local population, the sedentarist population, and the jihadists. They discuss about how to have an agreement concerning what we call Sharia, and how to help people to organize this Sharia, and what we call Zakat, the payment of the taxes in the Sheptel, and if you have agricultural possibility to pay what we call the Zakat. And then after, the group of jihadists told the population of Dogon, we would like to invite you to be prudent with us. Don't denounce us to administration or to military. And then after, when we discuss in the agreement concerning 5 communes in the district of the Koro, for me, this agreement is very important for the leaders in the traditional sectors. This is an example of the case of discussion between jihadists and local people, Fulani jihadists and local people of Dogon. The second example is the case of Jalube. Jalube is in the flooded place. Jalube is a very important place today concerning what we call l'épicentre du conflict, the epicenter of the conflict in the flooded. And then in 1998, when the army arrived in Jalube, the jihadists decided to control and to decide an embargo. The philosophy of this intervention is you control the city of Jalube, army, and some people. We control the bush, we control agriculture, we control fisheries, we control all the capacity, all the resources. Why, for me, the problem of natural resources is large. And the jihadist vision of this capacity is very important. They would like to check the road, the corridors, and then they intervene some 3 months really to create really a big embargo. This is the second example. The third example is now the context of the Delta and the context of the dryland space. We notice now the jihadist group accentuated the pressure. They accentuated pressure on the market. They accentuated the pressure on the field, and then 3 years ago, the population have not the capacity, the Dogon, to go to cultivate and then to got the food. The situation creates a crisis of food. And then we notice the jihadist process is to continue to occupy, to continue to fight, and to continue to create a big problem of crisis and a problem of nutrition. And then the population continue to be refugees in many places in the central of Mali. I noticed with the policy brief with my colleague Sinimari that there is a big challenge, and we need to clarify what will happen between the nexus and interaction between local people, jihadist group, militias, and the army. And then the title of the discussion today is very important for me because we will note what we call climate change war. And then the future of this conflict will focus on climate change, because climate change is not only the problem of desertification. The climate change will focus on the capacity to manage really the natural resources. And then the group of extremist group, jihadists, and militias would like to check and to control local power and control natural resources. And then I would like to give you the main recommendation for our policy brief. The first point is how to create a de-escalation of the conflict between all the actors. The second point is the problem of the national comprehensive strategy. After the dialogue, the two dialogues organized 2 years ago, the first dialogue called Conference d'Entente Nationale, the National Agreement Conference, and the national dialogue agreed last year. We need to have in Mali what we call a kind of national comprehensive strategy for dialogue. And the transition system now, political system would like to organize it and to see how to manage it, what kind of roadmap they will have, and what kind of action plan they will have for this dialogue. The fourth recommendation is how international donors can help to identify a strategy of dialogue with the government. We will set up the national actors and the level actors, what we call social actors and infrastructural actors. And then what kind of recommendation we will have concerning the equal access of natural resources. I think this is the big challenge of the central region and the central Sahel in Mali. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Boubacar. I think, Per, will you take over from now, the chairing?
I will, yes, thank you. So after an inside look in Central Mali, we're moving along to Central Africa. And I will share my screen now with you. Let's see if this works, yes. Before I leave the floor to our speakers from the region, let me just say a couple of words about the research effort from which this stems. A couple of years ago, Soleil Parfait and myself were involved in a large study on the political economy of conflict in the Central African Republic. Now, for those of you who don't know the context, is a vast, relatively unpopulated country which has been home to peacefully coexisting Mbororo herders and farmers, more or less, before unrest and ultimately civil war in 2013 disrupted all this, with violence taking a heavy toll on both herding and farming communities. Ever since, about 15 armed groups control roughly 70% of the national territory. What we found in a study was that these armed groups disproportionately focus on controlling trade routes, as attested to by the 300 roadblocks that we found. But along the way, we also found something that didn't fit into this picture. In nearly all of the country's borderlands, armed groups seem to follow a different geographical logic, one more informed by the movement of cattle than anything else. Now, if you look closely at maps of where many of them take up positions and what kind of places they fight over, just like in Mali, you'll find that it concerns herding grounds and strategic points along the routes that transboundary herders from neighboring Chad and Cameroon take. In virtue of its ecology, CAR has developed into an attraction for a shifting mix of herders, both more traditional small-scale herders and new ones who tend the herds owned by urban elites elsewhere and move around with guns and satellite phones. This raised all sorts of questions. What drives herders to choose to take their precious cattle to a conflict-ridden place as the Central African Republic? How are armed groups involved in the governance of access to natural resources? And what role does climate change play in all this? A collaborative survey among over 1,000 herders and farmers, together with the International Peace Information Service and Concordis, soon to be released, reveals that many of these transboundary herders complain about increasing drought and the degrading quality of pastures back home, and that the armed groups which have occupied the borderlands of CAR offer them the possibility of saving their herds by demanding fairly predictable taxes in exchange for access to CAR's rich pastures. They have, in effect, destroyed pre-existing negotiations between local people and herders over access to land. And turning it into a commodity. As one herder from Chad put it to us, you can't negotiate with a draft, but you can negotiate with an armed group. So as a follow-up, we decided to delve into this nexus of cattle mobility and armed groups. And what you'll hear now are fresh findings from recent fieldwork. So Soleil Parfait, you have been looking at exactly how armed groups govern cattle mobility at the border between Cameroon and the Central African Republic, focusing on the notorious armed group 3R. Can you tell us what you found? And here to the audience, you can find a button in the bottom of your screen, allowing you to activate translation into English if you need so. Soleil, the floor is yours.
Bonjour tout le monde. Sans plus tarder, je vais aller droit au but. Désormais, ce n'est un secret pour personne. Le bétail représente un maillon on ne peut plus indispensable du secteur économique des groupes armés et ça continue d'alimenter le conflit centrafricain. Déjà en 2017, lors d'une étude sur l'économie politique des barrières routières en République centrafricaine, que nous avions déjà abordé cet aspect. Ça, vous le trouverez dans le rapport de recherche intitulé « Laisser piller l'économie politique des barrières routières en République centrafricaine » que l'animateur, le chercheur Pierre et moi avions publié. Cette fois-ci, nous avons circonscrit la recherche seulement autour des questions relatives à la mobilité bovine, particulièrement dans la zone du nord-ouest contrôlée par le frère du général Abbas Sidiki. En attendant la publication du rapport final de cette étude, nous avons l'occasion aujourd'hui de présenter de manière vraiment succincte comment le groupe 3R contrôle et profite au mieux de la transhumance. L'État, qui est le premier garant de la sécurité des personnes et des biens sur son sol à un moment donné, était défaillant et ne contrôlait absolument rien dans plusieurs parties du pays. Cette défaillance a donc finalement poussé les communautés à développer leurs propres mécanismes de protection et de survie. C'est ainsi que les communes d'élevage de la région du Nord-Ouest ont donné naissance au groupe 3R. Le groupe 3R donc s'est alors assigné la mission de protéger la communauté Peul du Nord-Ouest ainsi que leur bétail. Pour atteindre cet objectif, le général Sidiki, patron des 3R, a développé un programme, je dirais, de protection des éleveurs qu'on appellerait volontiers Cattle for Security. Les éleveurs eux-mêmes payent le prix de leur sécurité et malheureusement, ils en paient vraiment le prix fort. Contre du bétail, ils peuvent continuer de paître tranquillement. Après tout, ils n'ont pas le choix. On sait qu'il y a différents types d'éleveurs. Il y a les sédentaires, il y a les semi-sédentaires et il y a les nomades qu'on appelle généralement les transhumants. Mais leur dénominateur commun reste le bétail. La politique du Cattle for Security des 3R s'applique donc spontanément à tout le monde de la même manière, à quelques différences près, et cette différence se situe au niveau des taxes d'entrée sur le territoire centrafricain, ces taxes qui sont imposées aux éleveurs transhumants étrangers au niveau de la frontière. l'éleveur transhumant étranger, donc au niveau des postes frontaliers qui sont contrôlés par les 3R, doit donner comme droit d'entrée et de pâturage sur le sol centrafricain un bœuf par troupeau, plus une somme de 50 000 francs CFA qui est considérée comme droit de déplacement des 3R avant de fouler le sol centrafricain. Je vais apporter une petite précision sur ce qu'on appelle troupeau. C'est un ensemble, ça varie de 50 têtes de bœuf à 100 têtes de bœuf. Donc, à partir de 50, on peut déjà considérer que c'est un troupeau de bœuf. C'est juste une parenthèse pour comprendre un peu ces prélèvements des taxes. Donc, ceci étant, le ticket d'entrée d'un transhumant étranger propriétaire de 10 troupeaux, par exemple, serait logiquement un bœuf fois 10, ce qui va donner 10 bœufs, et 50 000 francs comme droit de déplacement des 3R fois 10 aussi, ça va donner mathématiquement 500 000 francs CFA. Voilà les droits à payer pour les transhumants étrangers avant même de rentrer sur le sol centrafricain. Une fois à l'intérieur du pays, le reste du traitement est identique pour tout le monde. C'est-à-dire mensuellement, le groupe armé prélève chez tous les éleveurs un bœuf par troupeau pour lui permettre de continuer de fonctionner. Pour mieux contrôler donc et contenir les mouvements des éleveurs dans leur empire afin d'en profiter, les 3R s'appuient sur l'organisation communautaire des peuls qui existe déjà en impliquant les lamidos et les ardos. Qui sont les lamidos et les ardos? Les lamidos sont les chefs traditionnels peuls à la tête d'une collectivité, tandis que les ardos sont les responsables des clans qui sont inclus dans une collectivité. Donc, en s'appuyant ainsi sur ces personnalités, les 3R ont ainsi la possibilité de connaître avec exactitude tous les éleveurs en activité dans la région avec le nombre de leur bétail. En ayant ainsi les listes de tous les éleveurs grâce aux ardos et lamidos, il ne reste plus aux 3R que d'organiser le prélèvement mensuel de ces zakas qui sont à l'origine des offrandes volontaires envers les responsables communautaires, mais actuellement, c'est devenu des offrandes obligatoires envers les groupes armés. Mais ce système seulement ne suffit pas aux 3R qui, en plus, ont développé un système parallèle de contrôle des éleveurs par le biais de... Ces derniers sont généralement des commerçants de bétail qui sont de connivence avec les 3R et qui jouent également le rôle d'informateurs. En réalité, les commerçants de bétail jouent un rôle vraiment prépondérant dans le système économique mis en place par les 3R et axé sur le bétail. Ces commerçants sont chargés de convertir en billets de banque c'est-à-dire en liquidité, les trésors vivants. Leur rôle ne s'arrête pas seulement à ce niveau. Ils sont très mobiles. Ils s'établissent dans des localités et informent le groupe armé de la position exacte des éleveurs à chaque fois. Ils sont souvent équipés d'un téléphone satellitaire pour rester en contact avec les 3R à partir de n'importe quelle position, même s'il n'y a pas les réseaux téléphoniques. Ainsi, un transhumant qui sort de la zone de juridiction des 3R est vite rattrapé par ceci et ramené dans les zones. Les parrains représentent à la fois, ils remontent toutes sortes d'informations, mais aussi pour mériter, je dirais, la crise politique centrafricaine permet plus particulièrement aujourd'hui de comprendre non seulement la force économique que représente l'élevage, mais aussi de découvrir ces multiples facettes dans un contexte de crise comme celle de la RCA. Évidemment, on est en mesure désormais de comprendre que la transhumance revêt plusieurs dimensions. D'abord, il y a la transhumance pour la transhumance, c'est-à-dire le mouvement du bétail en quête de pâturage dans son sens fondamental. Mais ensuite, il y a aussi la transhumance pour le business, qui est un canal de toutes sortes de mafias, entre autres le trafic d'armes, le commerce de minerais, le service de mercenariat, pour ne citer que cela. Mais là, ce sont des points que nous réservons pour des prochaines minutes. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Soleil. And I think we can say that we've been very lucky with the quality of the connection, considering that Soleil Parfait is ringing in from Bangui in the Central African Republic. Already here we can see some very interesting overlaps between what is happening in Central Mali and in the Central African Republic that I hope we can address later on. But for now, Pamabe, you've been looking at this question from the perspective of transboundary herders undertaking seasonal migration from Chad into the Central African Republic. What are some of the push and pull factors motivating them to basically empower the conflict economy in that country? Pamabe, the floor is yours. You will need to unmute. Il faut appuyer sur le bouton pour activer le son.
C'est bon? Vous m'écoutez maintenant?
Oui, merci.
Ok, merci. Et donc, la question qui m'a été posée, c'est de savoir, malgré toutes les raquettes, toutes les insécurités que Parfait venait de décrire, les éleveurs tchadiens continuent toujours à faire leur transhumance vers la RCA, quand bien même la frontière est officiellement fermée. Et cette question a fait l'objet d'une enquête dans 2 régions à l'est du Tchad. Il s'agissait de la zone du lac Iro, où ce sont les éleveurs arabes qui transhumaient effectivement vers la zone de Seleka. Et donc, nous avons aussi enquêté dans la zone de Maro, où c'est les éleveurs Peul qui transhumaient plutôt dans la zone de Antibalaka. Et effectivement, même s'il y a les Arabes dans cette zone, eux, ils n'arrivent pas à transhumer dans la zone de Seleka parce qu'ils sont traités par les anti-Balaka comme les complices de Seleka. Donc, voilà un peu les questions qu'on a abordées au cours de cette recherche. C'est pourquoi, malgré toutes ces tracasseries, les éleveurs continuent à aller en RCA. Pour quel mobile? Quelle est la stratégie qu'ils ont mis en place? Et est-ce que cette stratégie, finalement, est efficace? Voilà un peu les 3 questions que nous avons voulu aborder. Donc, c'est en fait, maintenant, le mobile, pourquoi les éleveurs tchadiens continuent à aller vers la RCA? Le vrai problème, c'est un problème. Certainement, il y a ce changement climatique qui a entraîné 2 fois les sécheresses, 2 fois l'inondation. Donc, il y a l'excès de pluie ou le déficit de pluie. De toute façon, de 2 manières, il perturbe le cycle végétatif. Si c'est le déficit, la production, la biomasse diminue. Et si c'est en excès, la biomasse aussi pourrit dans les bas-fonds. Donc, de toute façon, les éleveurs sont toujours perdants dans les 2 cas. Et ce qui fait que, avec l'augmentation de la pression humaine dans cet espace qui est trop restreint, et vers la fin de l'année, l'alimentation du bétail ne permet plus de suffire la reproduction sociale des animaux. Donc, les éleveurs sont obligés, malgré toutes ces tracasseries, que ce soit aux côtés du Tchad, puisque pour aller là-bas, il faut d'abord payer, parce que la frontière est fermée, il faut payer les autorités militaires, qui va dans 150 à 300 000 francs par troupeau. En plus, si vous amenez un cheval, il faut aussi payer 50 à 100 000 francs par cheval. Donc, vous voyez que c'est déjà énorme. Et comme vous l'avez dit, parfait, arriver l'entrée sur la Centrafrique, il faut payer le droit d'entrée. Et malgré tout ça, les éleveurs continuent à dire. Qu'est-ce qu'ils nous disent? Ils disent, pour l'éleveur, là où il y a la garantie, il y a la sécurité des animaux, ils iront toujours, même s'il y a les dangers pour les hommes. Mais par contre, si là où ils sont en sécurité et que leurs animaux ne sont pas en sécurité, ils ne resteront pas dans cette zone-là. Donc, c'est cette logique qui fait qu'au Tchad, s'ils restent, au bout de fin d'année, ils perdent 10, 15 têtes. Mais ils ont un problème, ils ont une sécurité relative. Mais quand ils vont en RCA, ils ne perdent pas les animaux, ne serait-ce pour vendre seulement pour payer la sécurité. Donc, c'est ça qui nous ont dit comme motif de la traversée de la frontière. Et ils sont prêts à continuer, quels que soient les prix, tant qu'ils n'ont pas des suppléments au Tchad, c'est-à-dire que s'ils n'ont pas des compléments alimentaires, comme si on ne met pas à leur disposition des aliments, du bétail, des troupeaux, ils vont toujours traverser. On a dit quels sont les acteurs qui traversent, parce qu'on a tendance à dire que ce sont les bergers, ce sont les bergers des hauts cadres militaires qui traversent. Mais on s'est rendu compte que, au regard de l'insécurité, au regard des enjeux, des défis, chacun traverse avec son troupeau. Donc, vous ne pouvez pas engager à porter le troupeau d'autres quelqu'un et vous mettre en péril votre famille, une partie de votre famille. Donc, ils partent avec leur propre troupeau, mais même s'il y a le confiance, c'est que 2 ou 3 têtes, mais ce n'est pas comme les gens le disent, ils traversent avec les troupeaux des autorités administratives. Là, on n'a pas vérifié sur le terrain. Mais qui se déplace? La question qu'on a dit, qui se déplace? On s'est rendu compte que l'éleveur, il va jusqu'à la frontière avec sa famille. Après, il laisse sa famille à la frontière avec quelques vaches laitières et il traverse seul. À la rigueur, avec son berger, le propriétaire avec le berger, mais jamais avec la famille. Ça, c'est aussi une stratégie pour être très mobile de l'autre côté de la RCA. Parce que si vous allez avec une famille et s'il fallait fuir une nuit ou fuir, vous ne pouvez pas mobiliser la famille au même moment. Donc, du coup, il laisse la famille de l'autre côté, il part seul, soit sur le berger et soit c'est le propriétaire du bétail. Mais du côté tchadien, ben, contrairement à ce que Parfait nous dit, ils disent que dès qu'ils arrivent, ils payent. Et du coup, moi, quand ils payent, on leur donne des reçus. Et ces reçus, c'est en quelque sorte une garantie pour leur sécurité. Même s'ils rentrent dans une zone d'un autre groupe armé, vous présentez seulement votre reçu, mais on vous prend peut-être un taureau ou juste pour l'alimentation. Mais on ne vous demande plus de repayer. Mais sinon, au début, ils payaient à chaque fois qu'ils bougeaient. Mais c'est le groupe armé même qui se sont entendus pour se mettre d'accord et pour dire que s'il y a un groupe qui prend, il ne faut pas que l'autre groupe reprenne. Donc, voilà un peu ce qui se passe. Maintenant, est-ce que la stratégie est efficace, finalement? On s'est rendu compte, effectivement, ce n'est pas trop efficace. Et du coup, ils dépensent plus ou moins la valeur où ils seraient restés au Tchad. Et nous pensons qu'il faut que l'État essaye d'ouvrir officiellement les frontières, mais les deux pays doivent sécuriser leurs frontières. Le Tchad est prêt à dialoguer avec l'État centrafricain pour ouvrir la frontière, mais il se dit, mais avec qui je vais dialoguer de l'autre côté? Moi, je reconnais l'État centrafricain, l'État de Bangui, mais je ne peux pas me mettre à dialoguer avec un groupe armé. Voilà le problème qui est resté jusqu'à aujourd'hui et ça fait l'affaire des militaires de part et d'autre. Voilà un peu ce que je voulais vous dire de pourquoi les éleveurs continuent toujours à traverser pour aller en RCA. Sur ce, je vous remercie et s'il y a des questions, je reste disponible. Merci.
so much, Pabame, for your intervention. So Amadou, you have been looking at nearly exactly the same question. What motivates herders to send their cattle to conflict-ridden Central African Republic from the perspective of Cameroon? And you've also looked a little bit at how cattle owners and herders negotiate perhaps some of the troubles they find along the way. Could you tell us a bit about what you found? C'est à toi, Amadou. Il faut activer le son.
Bonjour à tous les panélistes, bonjour à toute l'assistance d'ici au Cameroun. Et je suis très fier que M. Pabame Souniabé est intervenu juste avant moi parce que ça me réconforte sur les premières données et les résultats que nous avons eus qui sont pratiquement les mêmes. Donc, notre intervention est axée plus sur la motivation des propriétaires de bétail résidant au Cameroun et ayant leur bœufs en Centrafrique. Nous allons axer cette intervention sur 2 points. Premièrement, la motivation proprement dite et deuxièmement, la gouvernance, ce qu'on appelle gouvernance pastorale en Centrafrique. La motivation, premièrement. Lorsque nous rendions sur le terrain, et nous avions plusieurs questions à demander, à poser aux propriétaires de bétail. Et parmi lesquelles, pourquoi est-ce que vous êtes au Cameroun, vous envoyez vos bœufs en RCA, surtout à ce moment-ci? Et nous croyons que cette question était une grosse et ambiguë question, mais que non. Pour nos informateurs, cette question était la question la plus normale. Ils nous ont dit, c'est la meilleure chose à faire. Pourquoi? Parce que chaque propriétaire de bétail recherche 2 choses. Les 2 choses ont été bien sûr mentionnées par Pabame et par Soleil. D'abord, c'est le bon pâturage. Vous savez que ce thème-ci va dans le même sens que les autres intervenants ont dit, c'est-à-dire la dégradation de l'environnement. Auparavant, au nord Cameroun, on faisait la transhumance vers le sud et à l'est du Cameroun. Mais que maintenant, au sud et à l'est du Cameroun, le pâturage est tellement dégradé que les propriétaires de bétail sont obligés d'envoyer leurs bœufs en Centrafrique. Et ça, comme a dit Pabame, ce n'est pas une question de choix, c'est une question de contrainte, selon ce que nos informateurs nous ont dit. Alors, quand ils envoient cela, ils trouvent beaucoup de bénéfices, nous ont-ils dit. C'est-à-dire que d'abord, le pâturage est meilleur et ils nous ont dit que c'est le meilleur pâturage en Afrique centrale, dans le pâturage qui se trouve en Centrafrique. De 2, il y a une question de reproduction. Quand leurs bœufs sont en Centrafrique, ils se reproduisent davantage et plus vite que quand ils sont au Cameroun. Et ça, la question de profit. C'est-à-dire au Cameroun, quand un bœuf produit et met bas une fois pendant l'année, en Centrafrique, ce sera davantage plus, mais aussi avec plus de chances que le veau survive en Centrafrique qu'au Cameroun. Deuxièmement, il y a une question qui est un peu paradoxale, la question de sécurité. Parce que nous avions en tête qu'il y a eu un conflit, le conflit est en train de se produire en Centrafrique, mais qu'il y aura moins de sécurité en Centrafrique pour les bœufs qu'au Cameroun. Mais que non, nos informateurs nous ont avoué qu'avec les groupes armés, leurs bétails sont plus en sécurité parce qu'eux aussi, ils font partie de ceux-là qui ont pour motivation de préserver le bon pâturage afin que leur business, entre guillemets, progresse. Parce que tant qu'il y a les bœufs, ils vont se mouvoir et ils auront aussi des ressources financières. mais quand il n'y en aura pas de bétail, peut-être pour trouver un agriculteur et le contraindre de lui donner un revenu financier est plus difficile. Et troisièmement, quand on entre dans l'interaction entre les bergers, les propriétaires de bétail et les groupes rebelles, ou bien ceux-là en général qui gouvernent la région, nous allons voir un paradoxe là aussi. Parce que nous croyons que l'État centrafricain ou les autorités centrafricaines, pour être plus précis, sont à porte-à-faux avec les rebelles. Mais là où cela est assez limité, c'est ceci. Parce que, comme a dit Pabame, quand un propriétaire de bétail, qu'il soit berger, lui-même son propre berger, ou bien lui-même conduit ses troupeaux, il paye l'entrée et il paye certaines taxes. Et même auprès de ces autorités légales en Centrafrique, dès qu'ils présentent les reçus qu'ils ont payés auprès des groupes armés, nous ont-ils dit qu'ils ont la voie libre de passer parce qu'ils ont payé. C'est une chose surprenante, mais c'est ce qui se passe. C'est-à-dire qu'il faut payer, mais payer une fois. Comme Papa a dit, avant, on payait à chaque rencontre, soit des autorités, soit des groupes rebelles différents. Mais comme non, maintenant, quand vous payez, peut-être cela ressort de l'accord de Khartoum, où tout le monde s'est accordé sur la gouvernance pastorale. Et maintenant, ils se sentent assez quand même libres de se mouvoir. Et ils ont la garantie que leurs bœufs sont assez protégés. Pour dire que la question de la dégradation de l'environnement nous a conduit à une nouvelle gouvernance pastorale qui est une négociation tripartite entre les propriétaires de bétail qui englobe les bergers, les autorités locales ou légales en Centrafrique et maintenant les groupes rebelles. Donc, à ce niveau, nous voyons une franche collaboration, contrairement à ce qu'on pense ou bien ce qu'on entend dans les médias. Il y a une coordination et il y a une complémentarité, que chacun préserve les droits de l'autre et nous continuons à vivre. De là, je crois que pour ne pas être long, je crois que c'est ce que nous avons, nos données préliminaires. Donc, et je suis encore content de dire que Pabame et Soleil, nous avons vraiment trouvé des données similaires et ce qui conforte quand même cette étude. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, thank you everyone. This was a very interesting session with some very field-specific experiences to learn from. I'm gonna open up now the questions. There is a lot of them, and it's great to see that we still have more than 100 participants eager to start the questions. Some of the questions are more general in nature, and some of them are more specific to the presentations, but I will try to raise a few points that you can, all of the speakers, relate to, and then also address some of the more specific ones. So I cannot promise that, since we're already a bit above time, that we can answer all the questions, and maybe we will also allow for this Q&A session to go a bit above time. I think for the first question is actually to all of the speakers, and it relates to whether in this discussion about climate change, are we only looking at physical factors, or are research also looking into what she phrases as normative factors, or we could say more what are local people's perceptions of how they see their environment changes? Does anyone have data on that or knows of studies looking to that? Then Cherry, someone is pushing you a bit to say more on how you look at the climate conflict nexus and how these things are interrelated. There's a lot of questions on the Sahel. I think one of them is related to how, Luca, do you see a change between earlier times, as we know, this desertification narratives, and also different interventions to try to stop desertification has been going on for some decades. Do you see any change in those initiatives and now? Then there's also the question of whether, and I think that is actually also interested to discuss for all, what is the whole idea of having such a sort of causal explanatory framework, and someone is pointing to sort of the fall of Muammar Gaddafi leader, so saying that these regional security dimension might be as explanatory for some of the conflicts we're seeing. So does it even make sense to have this sort of causal idea of that? Yeah, I think I'm gonna maybe take these a bit overall questions first, and then allow a round of you to present your answers for that. So maybe Luca, I will just take you in the round of presentations. Luca, do you want to go first? And please, if there are some of the questions in the Q&A that you particularly want to respond to, you're also more than welcome to do so.
Right. Thank you very much to all the panelists for the very interesting presentations and for the very interesting questions that helped me perhaps clarify a few of the points that I raised. I noticed that there's a couple of questions that are directed at me in particular, so I will try to pick them up as well and provide an answer. So there is a question whether the research solely look at physical factors, or does it also consider normative factors and perceptions? So in my case, what I've noticed is that most of the conflict climate research is based on abstract, large N type of research design. So it doesn't really look at factors that are not measurable, such as norms and perception. So the answer to this question, to my experience, would be that normative and factors and perceptions have played so far quite a marginal role in how we frame our understanding of conflict, climate nexus dynamics. And this is part of the problem. Then there is a question asking to what extent we can generalize the examples that I've made, and how to ensure that they are just not anecdotal. I think that this is an opportunity for me to clarify what I meant. Mine was precisely meant as a call not to generalize. As I see, the problem is exactly that. The problem is exactly with generalizations. In conflict analysis, context sensitivity is key. And the problem instead is one size fits all type of responses. What I want to demonstrate is not that fighting climate change or promoting environmental protection always fuels terrorism, but that this can happen in a few cases, perhaps anecdotal, but this happens if context and context sensitivity are not applied. So I think it's important to bear in mind that even anecdotal examples are very important to this end. Now there were a couple of questions about the idea of the grain wall of the Sahel or the Ceinture Verte kind of blocking the southward stretch of the desert. I think that there are a couple of, I would say, misperceptions built into the framing of this problem. The first is that the tragedy of the commons type of argument that underpins the ideological foundation of this project is rather simplistic, essentially because its strong rational choice assumptions are not well suited to understanding Sahelian context. And this is essentially because they tend to overlook the mitigating effects of existing informal regulatory schemes that do exist and that help balance individual and collective interests in the area. And this also helps respond one other question, that is to say, what type of informal practices can be presented as traditional ways of managing natural resources. And I think a very interesting tradition of the Tuareg in the desert is that the concept of property is very different from the one that we have in Europe based on our own legal framings. The concept of usus et abusus does not apply to the Tuareg. There's no right to abuse one's own natural resources. Natural resources must be left free to reproduce. And therefore, I think it's important to highlight that aspect when understanding local ways to manage natural resources. Also, I think that the idea that Africa is subject to a very fast and dangerous desertification is very old. It dates back to early colonial time, and that has been often presented as part of the white man's burden, with perhaps a hidden idea of managing African resources and lands in a more rational way than the one that is known or is portrayed as typical of African actors. In fact, the idea of building this great green wall stretching from Dakar to Djibouti to block the southward advance of the Sahara dates back to the 50s. And it was the idea of a guy called Richard Barr Baker, an environmentalist. It has been resurrected following the droughts of the 70s and of the 80s, and has become one of the leading initiatives in the framework of the UN Convention to combat desertification and drought, and has become particularly popular in the 2010s in the Rio +20 summit, and then endorsed by FAO, and then endorsed by the Paris Summit on Climate Change. What the difference that I see is only that this project is becoming more and more gigantic. And I don't see many nuances attached to that that could potentially avoid the kind of pitfalls that we mentioned before. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Luca. Thierry, would you like to go next?
Yeah, well,
and please pick the questions you.
Yeah, I'll go very fast in the interest of time. About the nexus between conflict and climate change, I fully agree with Luca from the CAR perspective. Actually, the conflict is an expression of the strong competition for resources. It's not directly due to climate change. What I see in CAR, as I say, the move of pastoralists coming from the north to the Central African Republic is both the result of the degradation of their living conditions in their own countries, and the rise also of insecurity, or the rise of communal clashes. We've seen, for instance, in Chad, and I speak under the authority of Abame, Shuniabe, we've seen in Chad a series of inter-community clashes over the past 5 years, I would say. And I refer especially to the last one in Wadai and Sila, where the state of emergency was declared by the government to stop those clashes. So it's not only, of course, the climate change. Climate change is one of the many factors, basically, that are fueling the problems. So there must not be any simplistic narrative about the linkage between climate change and conflict. There is a question about environmental conservation on mitigating conflict risk. I want to outline something there, is that actually, when it comes to the land issue that has been mentioned, for instance, in Mali, what we see is that there are indeed sometimes a shortage and a problem about land allocation that is exacerbated by conflicting policies. I mean, the policy of agricultural development can conflict with, of course, cattle farming, but can also conflict, I speak in the case, especially in the case of CAR, with the conservation policy. because we've seen recently donors who are actually supporting those free policies. They want to increase the agricultural production, so the size of the land that is for agricultural production. At the same time, they are supporting the development of cattle farming. And thirdly, they also support the establishment of national parks. At one stage, there is a shortage of land, and that creates some more conflict. And I think some donors should actually rethink more closely their policies in those countries and make sure that their policies are not contradictory, actually.
Thank you very much, Thierry. Now, Boubacar, would you like to comment in general, and perhaps maybe also the question of how you see the jihadist groups have revised more traditional resource management processes? Could be interesting to hear your perspective on. Thank you.
Okay, just I would like to add some 2 or 3 points. The first point is now, when we analyze the context of clashes, community clashes, and militias and jihadist intervention, we have 2 kinds of group of conflicts. What we call conventional conflicts. Conventional conflicts are composed of what we call recurrent conflict and persistent conflict. For example, the rebellion are recurrent conflict, and persistent conflict are natural resources conflict who have been managed many years. This kind of conflict have not changed, have not influenced really the role of the state. Since 2012, after the intervention in the north, we noticed the emerging conflict and global conflict. We need to clarify this kind of point. This is very important for me in the study we have conducted in the central of Mali and in the center of the Sahel in general. The second point of my conclusion is now we have strong degradation of the community linked in relation between groups. For example, in the central Mali, we have what we call the group of Rimbe. Rimbe are noble people. And another group is the group of old slavery called Rimaibe. This problem is important in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso. And after we have the problem of questioning of the historical pact between communities. It is very important, the pact between pastorals and agriculture. And then the third point is the problem of the absence of opportunity of the groups who are fighting now. For example, for pastoralist group, the young herders, what are the features of these herders? They have not feature because they didn't go on the school. They are only herders and keeping animals many years. They have not any resources. And their philosophy is to go to resources and to fight against the vulnerability. The second group is what we call the Taliban. The Taliban groups are very important in all the countries in the Sahel. In Chad, in Niger, Mali, Mauritania, or Niger, we have a group of Taliban. We need to clarify what are the features of the Taliban, because the young Taliban are members of these groups. They have not featured because in Mali, for example, the Morocco helped 2 and 3 years ago to help to organize a meeting in Senegal and to train 100 Taliban. Most of the Taliban became and come back. They have not featured because they are not Muslim. They are not only imam. They are just person and they would like to have a feature. These kind of problems are a big impact of the solution in the Sahel and the central region in Mali. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Boubacar. I will just remind that we are already over time, but we will keep the Q&A for another 5 minutes to let the last speakers come with their perspective. Soleil Parfait, would you like to go next, please?
Okay, to continue and to give some perspective issues.
Boubacar, I think we're going to pass on to Soleil Parfait.
Yes, yeah.
Cher Soleil, est-ce que tu as des points à ajouter sur cette discussion et peut-être des ajouts aux questions et la discussion qui était menée jusqu'ici?
Je dirais que franchement, c'est une très belle coordination. J'apprécie ça. Par contre, je trouve qu'il y a une petite limite par rapport à notre propre coordination dans le cadre de la recherche, parce que certaines zones que M. Pabamé a montrées, par exemple, ils ont mené la recherche. Il a mentionné la ville de... Avant d'aller à Sar, il y a la ville de l'autre là. Ça, je trouve que c'est un peu plus au nord. J'ai une carte ici. Oui, la ville de Maroc se trouve beaucoup plus au nord, au centre-nord de la RCA, tandis que M. Amadou et moi sommes allés beaucoup plus vers le centre-ouest, et ce qui fait qu'il y a certains points qui s'expliquent. Par exemple, vers Maroc, vers le centre-nord, il y a le MPC et le FPRC qui s'associent et qui gouvernent un peu la région. Donc, du coup, il y a des ententes entre eux qui font que les éleveurs peuvent aller d'un point à un autre et changent de groupe armé. Et puis, voilà, il y a certaines ententes qui passent un peu plus facilement. Tandis que vers le centre-ouest, il n'y a que les 3 R. Et puis, tout autour, c'est plutôt le bandit de Bahar qui exerce un peu comme un Zaragina. Donc, et tout autour aussi, il y a les Balaka. Donc, du coup, il n'y a pas entente. Et lorsqu'un éleveur quitte un milieu, la zone des 3 R, sous contrôle des 3 R, pour se retrouver, par exemple, dans les secteurs que contrôle ou les anti-Balaka, ça, c'est tout autre chose. Donc, c'est juste cet aspect. S'il y avait une meilleure... Nos recherches dans la zone Tchad, Mbaye-Bokoum, à la limite vers Gorée, de Gorée vers Mbaye-Bokoum, on va voir que franchement, il ne va pas y avoir de discordance, mais absolument de similitudes. C'est ce que je comptais ajouter.
Ok, merci beaucoup, Soleil Parfait. Il ne reste pas beaucoup de temps, donc on va passer la parole pour Pabamé. Merci. Et il faut être très bref parce qu'il reste quelques minutes.
Merci. Moi, j'ai pas beaucoup de choses à ajouter, sauf c'est une inquiétude. Et je sais que les éleveurs sont prêts encore à payer leur sécurité, mais ça risque de créer encore, nourrir cette insécurité en RCA, parce que les militaires, ils font la part des choses entre ce qu'ils trouvent, entre ce qu'ils vont trouver quand ils vont désarmer, quand on va les désarmer. Donc, je pense que si on ne coupe pas cette ressource de ces éleveurs, il n'y aura pas la paix en Centrafrique. C'est ça mon inquiétude à faire, parce qu'en écoutant les éleveurs, ils sont prêts à continuer à payer leur sécurité pour que leurs animaux puissent augmenter de taille. Voilà un peu l'inquiétude que j'ai par rapport à cette situation. Merci.
Ok, merci beaucoup, Pabamé. Amadou, Adamou, c'est pour toi. Après, je vais laisser Pierre finir.
Merci beaucoup, je crois que j'ai deux petites choses à ajouter du Niger qui demandaient quel rapport entre le paiement des taxes et la dégradation de l'environnement. Et je crois que s'il avait bien suivi l'intervention, j'ai dit au Nord Cameroun, quand le climat est, comme disent les Anglais, when climate behave very nicely, then they could stay there. Now that the climate has changed in the northern part of Cameroon and in the eastern part of Cameroon, they have to go to the Central African Republic. And then, if they want to stay, and if they want to conduct their pastoral lifestyle, they have to pay for it. So this is the link. Et deuxièmement, ce que je veux dire, c'est ce qui m'a beaucoup marqué, c'est la garantie ou bien les précautions que les propriétaires de bœufs prennent pour aller en Centrafrique. Parce que ce n'est pas donné. S'ils vont envoyer leur bétail là-bas, c'est juste pour que beaucoup au Cameroun, ils n'ont pas que ça, ce sont des opérateurs économiques. Mais les bœufs constituent aussi leur symbole identitaire. Et s'ils envoient là-bas, ils prennent des précautions. Comme ils nous ont dit qu'ils ne choisissent pas un berger par hasard. Et ils ne choisissent pas les lieux par hasard.